As a general rule, I don't like to speak too personally in these videos. I feel like my ideal role is to communicate ideas, and that I'm just the conduit for this communication. So I generally don't think my own personal story should play any leading role here. But insofar as telling portions of my own story might help more effectively communicate these ideas, I think it might be worthwhile. So, with that in mind, two major realizations, several years apart, helped shape and orient my life. The first hit more gradually when I was very young, and slowly but surely began to understand just how broken and corrupt this world had become, and how much of what we're all seeing and hearing was pure manipulative theater, a show put on for public consumption to allow truly terrible things to occur in the background, to understand how nearly every last modern war had been an unjust mistake, responsible for slaughtering millions of our most courageous, while quietly enriching a handful of our worst and most cowardly, how most modern revolutions weren't what they seemed, and how the hidden power structures they'd helped further usher into dominance essentially represented a noose slowly tightening around our necks, and how most people had been so drawn into this theater that recognizing it as theater had become nearly impossible for them, causing even some of my own friends and family to help normalize and further propagate this clown world, completely unconsciously. This first realization caused me to feel a bit like a soldier born behind enemy lines. Virtually nothing felt wholly comfortable to me. Nothing felt like home or resonated on the deepest levels. There were still a great many good individuals to be found, no doubt, but the system they were locked within, that the vast majority of them had been duped into playing along with, to varying degrees, was one swiftly inverting the virtues, morals, and ethics I intuitively knew to be right and healthy, in an eternal and timeless sense. A system that seemed to be everywhere stoking the most aggressive hatred of my fathers and ancestors, and all they had held to be most true and valuable. These realizations turned me from an extremely happy and lighthearted child into a very angry young man. There seemed to be no father at the head of this household, causing a drift into conditions in which order had seemingly broken down and been replaced with its most absurd imitation. And this realization hit me hard and made me genuinely capable of anything, and in fact eager to lash out and cause pain to any of those forces I believed even partially responsible for this degeneration. Anger became a bit like my fuel for a time, and for those that haven't been there before, it really can be a powerfully effective driving force. And if you're extremely careful, and equally lucky, and manage to wield it just right, it can even accomplish some great things. But it's never the ideal. It almost inevitably creates an unbalanced, asymmetrical person and personality, and the victories it yields are rarely the highest and best sort. And the same could probably be said, in most cases, of the means and methods of achieving them in this mode of being. Despite my attempts at self-discipline, while in this mental state, one almost can't help but become a loose cannon and a danger to themselves and everyone else. But then the second realization arrived. This one more suddenly and completely, like a eureka moment of sorts. And this was the realization that, in the final analysis, I wasn't in enemy territory. Finally capable of pulling my perspective back far enough to see the forest for the trees, I realized I was actually in friendly territory, ultimately controlled by my father, governed by immutable and inescapable laws in perfect balance, and that this temporary occupation, this rise to power of subversive and corrupting elements, was just a trial and obstacle to be overcome. After all, what would life be without a challenge, without monsters to slay, or darkness to banish? But this powerful realization was that as we engage in these battles, in this greatest of all sporting contests, on the battlefield of this material plane, we never truly lose ourselves, or this fight, unless we forget ourselves, our heritage, and that all existence is indirectly guided by the hand of a creator that exists above and beyond all things. Intuitively, I'd come to know, not think, but know, that this was the truth of our reality. This was, perhaps literally, a godsend, and one that almost certainly saved my life, despite a few close calls and bumps in the road. This video certainly isn't meant to be about me in any personal sense, but I share this only because I think it's fully relevant to what we're about to discuss. And I think the point is a vitally important one. History tends to move in cycles. When a people are so firmly locked into a particular extreme of this cyclical back and forth, especially if that particular extreme is the darker or more chaotic and degenerate and unhealthy extreme, it becomes almost impossible to even envision the opposite territory, let alone a path to get there. But it's incredibly important to recognize that we will get there. It's only a question of time. A question of when this pendulum might gain enough inertia to swing back in a positive direction with unstoppable force. But in the thick of it, at the lowest low, it's incredibly easy to feel hopeless, powerless, and as if there is no way out of this dystopian future quickly taking shape before our eyes. To feel essentially imprisoned by an administrative class of careerists and yes-men, hollow vessels willing to do or say whatever it takes to climb their respective occupational ladder. Errand boys, willing to do whatever it takes to make the true power brokers happy. These are men without bedrock principles, who instead have a flexible and adaptive sense of virtues and ethics, who freely bend and sway with the winds of modernity. It's become incredibly clear their goal is to cultivate a weaker and lesser sort of man, boundlessly respectful toward the self-professed expert class, conventional and conformist to their very core, completely dependent, and surrounded with bread and circuses, creature comforts and convenience, and all subsequent and related addictions, and often unreasonably terrified at the prospect of losing these. They're creating these bugman abominations by maximizing our addictions, be they sports or entertainment, prescription drugs or pot, porn or video games, while simultaneously changing our very biological chemistry. Never in the entire recorded history of mankind has our hormonal balance been this unnatural and off-kilter. Testosterone has experienced a freefall to the extent that a near majority of men are now practically impotent, and not just in a sexual context. This new creature being created wouldn't be recognized as a man in virtually any other age. But it's even worse than this. To speak a bit broadly and abstractly for a moment, it feels almost as if virtually every aspect of modernity was designed to maximize the expression of a certain something and to minimize and restrain the expression of its opposite, and that this dynamic represents practically the inverse of what was experienced by our ancestors. It's as if all modernity seems oriented to break down positive coherence, to eliminate our ability to operate and resonate on the same frequency, to prevent all unity of thought and action. The focus of the dark magicians behind the scenes seems to be a complete breakdown of group intention. Tesla once famously spoke of all reality being best understood via the concepts of vibration, energy, and frequency, and it's as if it's been made impossible for our energy to collectively vibrate on the same frequency. Instead, only the most negative and fruitless frequencies are pushed to the fore. Meat market apps pushing hookup culture have helped destroy the traditional family unit, and even the desire for it and the understanding of its value, while teaching the more attractive men bad habits, stoking anger and resentment in the less attractive, and across the board, leaving women ever more broken and angry, and increasingly resentful and hateful toward men. The television we've all made central in our homes has, in so many cases, replaced our own friends and family with actors and actresses that still fill this same role and need within us, yet in the most unnatural and net negative manner. Our ideas, our norms, our sense of the world at large is increasingly shaped by these personalities and these artificial friends, who, of course, are just the palatable face and mouthpiece of the ideas of writers and directors and producers. Apps like TikTok, which we're now finally discovering, may be literal psychological weapons, push the most cheap and mindless content into the homes and the minds of tens of millions on a daily basis, with algorithms much like YouTube's, designed to reward not just the worst types of content, but quantity over quality, encouraging all content creators to churn out material as quickly as possible, regardless if they have anything to say, and in fact, especially if they don't have anything to say. And while our attention span and ability to focus is obliterated, and we're being trained to hop from one addiction to the next in the pursuit of a fleeting and superficial endorphin rush, our physical and material world is being taken over. Our political and economic structures and our culture at large is being wholly reshaped to best suit this new form of tyrannical control. Two major events have been made clever use of to further tighten this noose around our necks. The virus and the quote solution, which has been forced upon much of the world and has already caused incalculable death and suffering, with so much more to come. And quote climate change, the almost comically absurd idea that the carbon emissions of human beings within the last few decades are going to essentially destroy all of civilization. Nearly all of the most polluting activity in recent years comes from China. How is it that we're seeing such aggressive pushes to shut down energy production throughout America and Europe? How is it possible that a people could be so blinded as to so powerfully sabotage their own nations and set them up for disaster and mass poverty, all on the basis of the most wildly speculative guesswork on the part of experts with shady funding and an abysmal track record of judgment? The answer is a depressing one, and one that speaks to nearly every element of the collapse we're currently witnessing. A naive, gullible, and frightened public is being preyed upon by forces and factions with an understanding of psychology and human behavior that so far surpasses their own, to the extent that they're not just incapable of avoiding this brainwashing and mass conditioning, but as often as not incapable of even recognizing what's occurring. Strange creatures like Greta Thunberg appear and attain almost overnight celebrity and become the forces that most powerfully shape the public discussion. Almost nobody asks who her handlers are, where all of this funding and top-notch production value comes from, or why she will never speak to the most polluting nation on the planet, and instead remains laser-focused on destroying the energy production of Western nations. And those who do dare ask are immediately relegated to the sidelines, causing many to avoid this type of social or career suicide by simply staying quiet and learning to not ask any questions at all. And this is the epitome of the type and caliber of individual we're up against. A type that everywhere pushes crying children to the stage, hands them a script to read, and rubs their hands together in glee in the background, as the least aware and vigilant subsets of our population are conned into disarming their law-abiding citizens, or tolerating societal lockdowns, or forced injections, or rolling brownouts and blackouts, or water usage restrictions, or energy prices tripling or quadrupling or worse. The word insidious scarcely begins to cover it. These are people who are consciously taking advantage of our kindness and hospitality and fundamental decency, willfully hijacking and redirecting these positive impulses to more effectively destroy ourselves and commit national suicide. It's my hope and expectation that many of you might agree with me when I say the prospect of making slight changes or improvements to the world we currently live in doesn't intrigue me in the slightest, and is not something I'd be willing to fight for. The change must be profound if we care to reverse this tide, and if we ever hope to come anywhere near to the attainment of our fullest potential. Our spiritual decline and cultural rot can't hope to be reversed by a booming economy, or a simple change from Democrat to Republican, or liberal to conservative. Our problems now run far, far deeper, and the systems and structures built by these subversive power brokers represent multiple layers of fraud and deception and parasitism, and so help to further orchestrate it. Meaning, there are no longer any quick and easy fixes. We've reached a point where we need to be willing to utterly obliterate a great deal of this and start anew. We live in an age of unprecedented technological development, and an age in which we're able, in many respects, to do 5, 10, even 100 times as much as we might have been able to do decades or centuries ago with the same amount of effort. And so, every sensible person should be asking themselves, considering this is the case, why is it that we're required to still work just as many hours to even just tread water and stay afloat? The answer to this question is actually very simple, very clear and straightforward, and incredibly important to fully understand.
Discussion groups and so on. All that free association which made the English-speaking countries what they are still exists. It's just that there's a tax on it, roughly speaking half of what you earn, yes, which goes to maintain a sort of shadow community of parasites whose only justification is that they pretend to be governing us. You have to, we belong in an organism which is accompanied by a cancerous version of itself. That's the way it is.
This parasitic class has grown by leaps and bounds in recent years, and might fairly be compared to a vacuum, extracting vast amounts of wealth which directly represents our expenditure of time and energy, while creating or producing little to nothing of real value in return. These are men that have found clever ways to earn more and more for doing less and less. And to top it all off, they simultaneously portray themselves as the most important members of our societies. And we have accepted it. It's happened incrementally enough to where the vast majority of us don't bat an eye, and seem to believe this is, quote, just the way things are, and that this is just the way the world works. But it's not. It's the way our current world works, but it's not the way nations or societies have traditionally functioned, and certainly not the way they functioned at their peak of robust health and solidity. One last personal note about me, something that may have helped shape my own outlook and perspective here. Half of my family background has Mennonite roots, specifically tracing back to the Volga Germans who migrated to the north of the Black Sea to be able to live as they preferred to live, free from the tyrannical hands of governments or churches. Both the Mennonites and Amish have long histories of creating their own successful communities. I tend to think this is part of the reason I so bristle at the idea of such a thing being an impossibility. and why I find myself having so little patience with those nihilistic types who believe we're hopelessly and permanently locked within these dying and decaying systems and structures and ideological constructs, and that there's no way out. There certainly is. There always is. That's certainly not to say it's ever an easy or pleasant road, especially at the outset, but it is to say that it's fully possible, and in a sense, actually quite simple. It all boils down to this. If we believe there are certain globalist and internationalist structures that have a vision as to where they'd like to take the world, and if we agree that these organizations and institutions have infiltrated governments and media and corporate boards across the world and seem to be working together to accomplish these aims, and finally, if we can agree that the way they intend to force the unwilling to go along with their vision is to make use of this extreme dependence they've cultivated amongst the public, to the extent that they can deny employment, lock bank accounts, or prevent financial transactions, prevent air travel, completely silence you online, etc., to force you to comply. If we can agree that this is the situation we're facing, it seems there's only one solid and viable solution to all of this. We have to find ways to unify and work together to completely and utterly break that dependence. Everything revolves around this. It's precisely this servile dependence that stands to allow this tiny parasitic administrative class to do whatever they wish, whenever they wish, knowing full well that you're completely powerless to stand in opposition, because they control every significant lever in your life. It's human nature to take the path of least resistance and maximum benefit, so it's neither realistic nor tenable in the longer term to expect most people to take a stand and risk losing everything. Not just personally, but often their families as well. So it seems clear that what we need to do is work to massively lower this risk, which means minimizing this dependence, and consciously working to create alternative avenues whereby the average person can't be prevented from acquiring their basic needs, and struggle to eat or heat their home or maintain a job and pay their bills if they should ever disagree with the status quo. The solution I'm about to speak to is equally worthwhile no matter who you believe to be ultimately responsible for the orchestrated collapse and forcible cultural reorientation we're witnessing. Whether one believes the culprits to be banking families of a certain tribe with outsized control of the Federal Reserve and central banking structure, or whether you believe it's Jesuits or the Vatican or corrupted royals, or all of the above or other forces, these debates thankfully become almost entirely unnecessary and a moot point. That's not to say sorting these questions out becomes unimportant. It's only to say that part of the beauty of this solution is the question ceases to matter a great deal, especially in the early stages. It's also one that I hope might unite the various factions on our side of the fence. Any and all that are willing to work together to first toss off this yoke, which is, far and away, our greatest and most immediate threat. Now is not the time to be a contentious purist and refuse to work with anyone who doesn't see eye to eye with you across the board. We don't have that luxury at the moment, and there will be plenty of time for such important discussions down the line. Finding some way to eliminate this most pressing threat will open up a world of possibilities for all of us and completely change the information flow, which has the potential to completely change hearts and minds en masse. But it might take some interfactional unity to get us there. I'd like us to engage in a mental exercise. For the sake of this hypothetical, let's pretend a number of us decided to simply step aside, to find some land and start anew. And I'm going to outline a relatively radical vision as to how we might live differently, and I'm interested to know how much this resonates with all of you. Firstly, the broad strokes. the key ideas and concepts underlying every single aspect of the community that might develop atop and around them. Number 1, an embrace of simplicity over Byzantine complexity, wherever and whenever possible. This means simple rules, regulations, codes of conduct, simple ingredients in our food, simple materials to be used in the construction of our homes or consumer products and possessions. In short, everywhere a return to first principles, oriented toward further eliminating our level of dependence and drastically reducing the complexity involved in our subsistence, making us essentially immune to shocks to the system or to being locked out of this system. Number 2, an embrace of fruitful creation and production, and a conscious effort to completely eliminate parasitism. Every individual should either be teaching, learning, or doing. That is to say, being a master or apprentice and learning a skill set or mastering some worthwhile educational sphere, or somehow physically performing the act of creation. Number 3, similar to both previous points, in that it returns us to our most pure and simple roots and epitomizes fruitful creation and production. We should return to extolling and celebrating and doing everything we can to create the healthy and happy and stable family unit, and encourage marriages and the creation of new life as a primary purpose of the broader community. This idea that children are an unnecessary luxury that get in the way of our earning slightly more at a corporate job should be done away with completely. It's as perverse as it is dishonest and unnatural. Nothing is more important than this process of bringing new life into the world and ensuring it's shaped and oriented in the most robust and healthy manner possible, and ready, even eager, for any and all challenges the world may throw their way. The proof is now in. The past many years have shown this conclusively. Money is not what makes us happy on the deepest and most fundamental levels. It can certainly feel like it's producing happiness, especially in an immediate and superficial capacity, a bit like a drug high, but this quickly wears off, and the pursuit of wealth is the chasing of a moving target, because the more we have, the more we want. And we don't tend to judge ourselves or our success according to some immutable and consistent standard in these regards, but rather against our peers, which means this type of rat race competition is never ending. And even the handful at the very top of this pyramid almost never radiate a genuine happiness. This is more true today than at any time in history, in large part because of what's now required to climb these ladders. Invariably, and with few exceptions, it often involves essentially selling your soul and compromising your principles to become a vessel and puppet working to accomplish the aims of others. And number 4, the development of something like a barter system, ideally allowing us to work in these newly created occupations in direct exchange for trade in goods and services. In other words, allowing us to receive total, straightforward, direct compensation for our labor, without numerous middlemen and institutions taking their unearned and undeserved pound of flesh along the way. I love the idea of interconnected central hubs, perhaps one in each community, allowing us all to trade directly with one another, and possibly even issue IOUs or promises to pay in the future in cases in which it's deemed worthwhile to do so. Number 5, a conscious creation and orientation of all societal and cultural structures, not around maximizing monetary gain, but rather the maximization of physical, mental, and spiritual health. This might include the encouragement of organized sports and gyms and hiking or kayaking or sailing clubs or anything similar. Creative solutions to matchmaking and introductions and relationship creation. Fundamentally fruitful educational classes of all varieties. the creation of churches according to the beliefs of the specific community. In other words, an effort to channel that energy that most currently devote to making a quick buck down paths that do far more fundamental and lasting good. Structures that serve people, as opposed to structures that people end up serving. And finally, number 6. There should be very real and very clear proactive purpose behind these communities and their collective efforts. In other words, this shouldn't just be a means for us to escape a collapsing world, and for a small pocket of us to stay somewhat sane as all outside burns to the ground. If we're correct, and if we're headed for some uniquely difficult and trying times that threaten to produce immense suffering and hardship, our simple and straightforward purpose and goal should be this: to help all good, genuine, like-minded individuals in every sphere that we're able. Right this second, as I speak these words, there are tens of thousands of deeply good people suffering profoundly in a multitude of ways, and I'm sure several of you listening are in these ranks. White Americans, especially, have seen their average income plummet in recent years, while inflation skyrockets. They're now far more underrepresented in the, quote, best universities than any other ethnic group, by far, to the extent that right-leaning males, especially, have become wholly shut out, with the most recent data showing that between a non-Jewish white Christian and a Jewish individual, both with equal academic performance, the latter is 10 to 15 times more likely to gain admission to Ivy League schools. And, of course, should you even gain admission, good luck finding a single professor willing to entertain your points of view, or give you passing grades, should you dare express them. These credential mills have become a hotbed of far leftist political and cultural agitation, completely losing sight of their initial goals of higher education. And of course, this is just a microcosm of the larger situation. The aim is to not just prevent you from attaining those pieces of paper that prove to corporate institutions that you're suitably obedient and conformist, but to eliminate you from police forces, as they did so effectively in the aftermath of the Floyd incident and the BLM riots, to remove you from military service, as they did so effectively during the COVID hysteria, and the purge of, quote, insurrectionist sympathizers at the behest of the criminally incompetent and corrupt General Milley and that embarrassment to our nation, Lloyd Austin. So they don't just want to completely silence your opinions, online and elsewhere. They want to bankrupt and utterly destroy you. Several years ago, I would have considered this to likely be an exaggeration. Anyone still considering it an exaggeration is either ignorant or willfully obtuse. I say all of this to make this point. We're losing profoundly good people. More so at this point than at any point in our lifetimes, I'd argue. Good people who are destroying or ending their lives out of sheer desperation and hopelessness, as a result of a system that now seems designed to do just this, to grind a certain demographic to dust, to utterly exhaust and drain, and to wholly transfer all positions of power and influence, as well as land, money, and all other forms of wealth, to their opposites across every sphere, and to call this virtuous as they do so. And that our goal, it might even be fair to say our foremost and primary goal, is to begin to meaningfully help these people, to establish structure and networks that allow us to do so on a respectable scale. Such an effort will not only save lives, it'll help completely turn lives around, providing a sense of purpose and direction and a justified sense of fulfillment and optimism. Not only would this make it extremely difficult for the other side of the fence to paint us as a threat, as violent and uncaring, and all of the other similar caricatures they're working so hard to create in the public consciousness, but far more importantly, it's simply the right thing to do. It's true that we have little to no control over our, quote, optics, or how we're eventually portrayed, but we need to just accept this as a given and play the cards we're dealt. And I strongly believe that it's just by doing good, doing that which we know to be right at every turn, that'll help eventually convince the world at large that they're being lied to about the factions involved in this fight. Many of us have had this obsessive focus on winning political battles, as if our simply having better ideas might win the day. This isn't the world we live in at present, and it's my belief that we don't need to say better things. We simply need to do better. No need for fanfare and hype or manipulation. If we can simply be the force for good, clearly aligned against a ravenously parasitic and destructive force, the right types of people will naturally resonate and join our ranks. And on this note, I'd like to speak for a moment about the entirely unique challenges we face, and why we can't do what those on the left so freely and flippantly do, namely set up a single centralized organization or group, give it a name and raise a banner accordingly, and simply get to work. The reason those on the left are able to do this is because of successful institutional capture, meaning the bot press is completely on their side and always represents the wind at their back and their foremost champions and promoters. But more importantly, virtually the entire national security apparatus is now drawn from their ranks, at least the foremost leadership positions, within organizations like the FBI or CIA or the DOJ or DHS. We shouldn't deny the significance of this and the extent to which it makes our battle a steeply uphill fight, and one that we need to fight as proficiently as is possible. We don't have the luxury of making significant mistakes here. All of this can be an extremely black pill for many, and it's understandable as to why. Those who've been following closely will understand the following all-important point. The moment our side experiences some real success, and does manage to raise a banner that doesn't radiate negative energy, but instead is genuinely compelling and attractive and draws the right sorts of people for the right sorts of reasons, this banner, and all of those holding it, will be aggressively attacked from nearly all sides. And not in a direct, respectable, above-board type of way, in which our enemies identify themselves as such, wear opposing uniforms, figuratively speaking, and are easily recognized as enemies accordingly, but rather in the most underhanded and devious and manipulative ways. We'll see controlled opposition figures doing their level best to hijack the energy and inertia to later drive it into a wall. We'll likely see false flag type attacks from individuals claiming to be affiliated and who may well have FBI fingerprints all over them and deeply suspect connections. We'd see an orchestrated media campaign like no other, far worse, in fact, than even Trump faced, and in my view, worse and more extreme than we've ever seen before. We'll see countless attempts by bad actors to infiltrate, many of which will likely be successful to some degree, regardless of the solutions we hit upon to keep these individuals at arm's length. Virtually every type of ignoble and weaselly tactic you can imagine would likely be employed here to ensure this new banner was as muddied and polluted as is possible, and made as unattractive as is possible. We've had all too many of us fall into one of two groups: those who don't fully understand what we're up against, and those that do, yet are so black-pilled and demoralized by this recognition that they're essentially paralyzed as a result. I'd like to do everything I can possibly do to completely collapse these two groups and create a third group in their stead, one that fully recognizes what we're up against and has simply recognized the need to take a stand regardless, and simply seeks the best and most viable path to do so. And it's to this third group, and all of its current and future members, that I'd like to address the following idea, which is the very purpose of this entire video. If we can agree that the other side is seeking to strip us of real value, food, energy, land, precious metals, and replace it with worthless paper, rentals, and leases, and thus foster total and weaponized dependence in the process. The only truly viable solution I see is to work to directly counter both of these plans of action, namely return to the land and return to hard assets and the ability to produce and create real value, and to do so in a wholly decentralized way, at least at the outset, to avoid creating any singular target for the obscenely corrupt forces who'd so desperately want to take aim. Now, again, this is all in the very hypothetical ideation stage, so I say these things to kick off a larger discussion before any of this is actually brought to fruition. But what I'd like to see us do is somehow create a fund, ideally with total transparency, to be used to incrementally buy up pockets of land. Land that would then be essentially loaned to the best and brightest in our ranks, that are most eager and able to make good and efficient use of it. Farming and the raising of food animals, for example, would be a foremost initial priority, but there are several other ways to yield real value. Construction projects to add a great deal of worth to the land, things like fishing or crabbing, beekeeping, master and apprenticeship style classes to teach a range of the most necessary and relevant real-world skills. I also love the idea of employing individuals in the creation and maintenance of an effective barter system, with one central hub in each community which might freely trade with one another to ensure all necessities are covered at all times. What I'm envisioning is something like a committee of our most trusted individuals, ideally with some proven judgment and discernment and relevant competence, whose work would be separated into two parts. The first, finding the best possible value with regard to new land purchases, and strike the best possible deals accordingly to secure the land. The second, finding the ideal individuals to grant this land to, those most likely to make optimal use of it, with optimal here being defined as being the greatest benefit to the rest of us in case of full-scale collapse, or of our being permanently shut out of the existing system, in a manner similar to that which very nearly occurred in the case of COVID. It's vital to understand, at least as I'm envisioning it, and I hope most of you might agree, or otherwise offer a very strong counter-argument, that all of this wouldn't and shouldn't be approached as a money-making operation, or as one might approach a business, with a profit motive at the fore. Meaning those who donated to the fund, and it's my hope that we might find one or two wealthy and generous donors to get this ball rolling, as opposed to collecting thousands of smaller donations, though both would be welcome. But those who give need to see their donations as giving, more than some investment that's likely to yield them significant profit in the short or mid-term. Anything is certainly possible, but it should be assumed by donors that this won't happen, that the initial phases would be almost all expenses and very little return, and those willing to give would need to be comfortable with this. I understand it's a lot to ask, but we'd be seeking to do something very real, very significant, and very serious here, not simply be one more entity seeking to make a quick buck. I'm well aware that this will make gathering funds a bit more difficult, but I have a hunch, and I've been lucky enough to personally see a fair bit of evidence to support this theory, that there certainly exist individuals with significant wealth who want to do real, meaningful, and fundamental good, of the type that most modern philanthropy only mimics, at best. And even then, it usually devolves into a clever tax dodge, with most of the monies going into some Byzantine black hole, and a very small percent of total donated capital being used for the stated purpose of the charity or fund. Those who throw money in these directions represent the style, those doing so for reasons of ego and appearance, whereas we would be looking for substance instead. Those who care less about the adulation and superficial trappings, and more about the real-world impact of their contributions. Though, ironically, there may be quite a bit of adulation that results. I could certainly see the biggest donors being deeply appreciated for their generosity by all involved. The ideal would be to watch this fund and its resulting purchases continue to grow and grow indefinitely, with those benefiting from the purchased land often being willing to reinvest a portion of this benefit back into the fund. As the amount of land this fund is able to purchase gradually grows, and especially as we're able to secure sizable pockets of contiguous land, we're then faced with the possibility of allowing others to move in, and the prospect of beginning to create brand new communities. I love the idea of our working together to find the most cost-efficient and yet fully comfortable and livable types of homes we might construct on these plots. YouTube certainly provides a wealth of valuable context here, with comprehensive videos speaking to the construction of log cabins, sod houses, A-frames. I'd like to see us work together to find the very best and brightest examples that best strike that artful balance between being inexpensive and a good value, yet being fully livable, comfortable, and inviting.
And you know, limitations are not necessarily bad. They actually inspire creation. Because if you can go to a store and buy it, it's too easy, you just buy it. If you can't buy it, then you have to make it. So this is sort of a personal expression of an artistic form, and we did it for us to live in. Now this is a third house. We first built the little cabin, and we did that in 5 half days. We got a cabin.
I've also been incredibly drawn to the idea of terraforming land, and strongly encourage others to watch the video I've linked in the description. There exist men with the knowledge and experience necessary to turn even the most seemingly barren and inhospitable land into something beautiful and full of life. Harnessing their genius and pairing it with a willing and eager workforce, I feel like we might accomplish some genuinely impressive things. And if so, this would significantly widen our options when it comes to new land purchases. And this may sound strange, and may even sound like a digression, but even in these earliest stages, I'd like to see beauty be one of our foremost priorities as we create new communities and living spaces. And I really do mean a priority. Things like planting trees and gardens and landscaping in general, the types of paths and streets and walkways, lamps and streetlights and any public lighting. I'd like to see all such planning engaged in with aesthetics foremost in mind. Even without immense wealth to work with, there's absolutely no reason one needs to live in ugly surroundings, especially if individuals with the proper skill sets and expertise were willing to put forth the necessary effort to ensure otherwise. I love the idea of every square inch of land existing within, quote, our territory, being prized and valued to the extent that all sought to improve and beautify it accordingly. Of course, I understand that not everyone is able to pick up and move locations, and that a great many listening wouldn't have an immediately useful skill set, even if they were able to. This is understandable and to be expected. I love the idea of several master and apprenticeship dynamics popping up in these new territories to teach these most useful and needed skill sets for those willing to make the trek. But also, it should be understood that the majority who absolutely can't pick up and move at the moment could still benefit greatly from these land purchases and these communities, especially in case of collapse. Having a fair bit of land and beginning to store and stockpile food, for example, may well end up saving lives in the long run. One of the many ideas that's been floated would be the creation of a mutual support network, part of which, optionally, could be a storable food service for those interested. One of the problems traditionally with food stockpiles, and in fact the biggest problem by far as I see it, is that most people don't end up consuming it, of course. It sits there in case of need, but because that need rarely arises, I suspect most people either gorge on it as it nears expiration, or give it away, or toss it out. If we had sufficient people involved to create a proper network, it wouldn't be difficult to set up a subscription service, especially for those in more dangerous conditions in case of collapse, such as the elderly that live alone, to give one example, where this food is delivered and then picked up and replaced every X number of years, so that all who are a part of this network are guaranteed an ongoing, physically accessible stockpile of fresh food. The picked up and unopened portion, of course, could simply be sold at a discount to any takers for immediate consumption. I love the idea of parallel Uber-type networks to not just provide rides, but all manners of pickup and delivery, and the idea of a barter system, allowing us to engage in cash-free transactions, to get rid of all we don't need and receive all that we do want and need from trusted, like-minded parties. So the land purchasing will be one aspect of this broader idea I wanted to communicate, and now I'd like to speak to the other aspect. I spoke of the need for decentralization to make the activities of saboteurs and dishonest actors and generally slimy people that much more difficult to engage in, at the very least to prevent one singular target or banner becoming the focus of all of this nefarious intent. One of the ways I think we might accomplish this is to aggressively push the idea of creating small groups and clubs, both online and off, and then very loosely uniting these groups in a larger umbrella structure, one that would be nameless, bannerless, and only exist to periodically bring these various groups together and allow them to contact and communicate with one another. By groups, I mean any and every variety, according to your personal interests or hobbies. Hiking groups, MMA or weightlifting or boxing groups, book clubs or philosophical discussion clubs, historical research clubs, hunting clubs, even purely online groups, like those devoted to programming, web design, OPSEC, even gaming. In short, any and every type of club one could imagine. This umbrella structure would then hold periodic meetings, one type of meeting to be held online, the other type to be held in person. And all of these various groups that were able would be tasked with sending a single representative to attend. This strikes me as being an excellent way to foster some quick and easy unity and begin establishing lasting connections, as well as a means to begin accomplishing real things, gaining access to the widest variety of skill sets and competence and ideological allies, eager and willing to collaborate towards similar ends. If and when any issues need to be decided, a vote amongst all attending representatives might do just fine in the early stages, though we may decide to shift to a weighted vote as things progress, in which those groups with more members, or with more obviously net positive accomplishments, might subsequently earn nominations, granting them greater vote strength, to help both reward and incentivize net positive achievement. As I'm envisioning it, and keep in mind I'm only voicing ideas here, I look forward to constructive discussion and debate and altering this vision anywhere that seems appropriate. But as I envision it, an individual would be free to join as many groups as they pleased, as long as they weren't spreading themselves too thin by doing so, ideally. And some of these groups may not even often engage in the behaviors their title suggests. In other words, if I simply wanted to be involved in the broader discussions and meetings of this umbrella group, I may start a philosophical discussion club with 3 or 4 trusted friends, and perhaps we don't actually meet frequently, at least in a rigidly structured way. I think this should be acceptable. Of course, being a bit more rigid and consistent and structured is almost always advisable and suggested where possible. But it's even more important that those who want to be involved simply find some route to be able to do so. It's also important to recognize that several parallel communities and networks and constructs already exist. The platform Gab, for example, has opened some impressive doors on this front. I like the idea of the committee responsible for cultivating this umbrella structure and holding their meetings, being simultaneously responsible for outreach to these existing groups, to establish unity and common cause, and ideally to bring them into the fold. Countless doors could be opened if we're able to establish this first piece of solid ground beneath our feet and some baseline unity and cooperation. So it should be understood that this is a relatively quick and dirty means to an end. Who knows what it may one day develop into, but for the moment, in its earliest stages, I envision it just being a framework within which we're able to live more freely and work together to end our dangerous dependence on structures and institutions ultimately governed by those that hate us and will force our compliance if they're able to find a path to do so. But also, a framework allowing us to create new culture, new modes of living, and if a patchwork of interconnected real-world communities were to spring up and remain in regular contact, imagine what an effective petri dish this might be with regard to cultivating new ideas. Each individual community would be able to learn from one another's successes and failures, to try what seems to work best and discard what doesn't. Such an environment would have immense potential in the longer term. It would also operate as a mechanism to help bring our best and brightest individuals slowly but surely to the foreground, to find new leaders and to foster new hierarchy. In a sense, it would be acting as the most direct counter to unnatural globalism, an ideology of natural localism, for lack of a better term.
So, to summarize everything I've attempted to communicate in this video, and I hope I haven't attempted to cover too much ground in a single hour, we find ourselves in a tricky and dangerous position with walls closing in, and I feel we absolutely need to act before it becomes too late to do so. Whether it's COVID or climate change or the new digital currency they're likely to attempt to force upon us, a situation is being created where we'll be forced to comply, or else risk losing everything and living lives of extreme hardship and suffering. If this read is correct, we must work together to eliminate this total dependence, and to be able to provide the necessities of life to one another without having to rely on this completely corrupt structure. We should expect pushback and endless attempts to destroy our efforts to create this support structure, which is why I believe it needs to be as decentralized as is possible, and why we need to be exclusively focused on doing good and helping one another, as opposed to this being a vehicle to attack. For all of you angry and seeking a fight, trust me when I say the fight will come to us. We needn't provoke it at this point. And in fighting in defense of ourselves, our families, our culture and people and way of life, we have the most obvious high ground, and a message and approach that should help to wake many of that remainder still currently on the fence, and help some of the best among them slowly gravitate toward our side of this fence, and aid in our collective efforts. One last note, to any who might object to this plan of action with something to the effect of, if we step aside while things collapse, isn't this giving up and ceding control to our opponents? It's crucial to understand that no, it's not. Those who think the nation and its institutions, as is, can still somehow be salvaged, could conduct this fight far more efficiently with the type of unity and cohesion that would inevitably result from what I'm suggesting here. No matter what approach you believe to be ideal, I'd argue the path I'm suggesting would almost certainly make the approach easier. A scattered and disunited and atomized people has no chance in a fight against a centralized power. Walking this path that I've just begun to outline here would simply reduce their power over us, while simultaneously drastically increasing our ability to act effectively as a larger group. By any objective standard, I believe the upsides hugely outweigh any potential downsides. So, what may begin in a quick and dirty manner, fairly loose and informal, might slowly but surely develop into something beautiful, tremendously effective, and capable of doing immense good. And because hard times are here, and far harder times are likely just ahead, We have the potential to save lives with such an effort of some deeply good and worthwhile people who don't deserve to experience the hell they're being forcibly marched toward. When the next COVID is attempted and we're told either comply or be locked out, there's no reason we shouldn't be ready to reply with confidence, do your worst. And there's no excuse and no reason as to why we shouldn't be in a position to help all who are willing to respond similarly. It boils down to this, and it really is this simple. When you look about you and all around you has been corrupted and poisoned, is worm-eaten and termite-infested, and so obviously crumbling and collapsing, the merest shadow of what it once was and what it could and should be, there comes a point at which devoting the immense amount of time and energy required to simply keep the walls standing becomes an insane exercise in futility. The only solution is to step aside, let nature take its course, and devote yourself to the creation of something new, something worth your energy and attention and efforts, something your children or grandchildren might someday thank you for. Yes, the ideas and concepts I'm speaking to here are big, even idealistic. I recognize this. But in some sense, this is the very point. I can't help but feel that one of the worst things that's happened to us in recent decades is that our vision of what's possible is becoming ever narrower and more stunted and constrained. And this is absolutely by design. Let's consciously strive to become men of vision and fruitful purpose again. Time is short. Choose courage.